story that you might have heard about early Venetian history. The story goes something like this. Once upon a time, there were a scrappy bunch of refugees fleeing the Roman Empire from the invasion of the Huns. They were so desperate that they took shelter in an unpromising-looking lagoon and waited out the worst of it there. Through the ingenuity of their mind and the sweat of their brow, these refugees turned this swampy little backwater into a wonderful city. And then, with time, luck, and a lot of elbow grease, into a just and beautiful empire. That is the story of Venice as a outgrowth of the Romans, or perhaps the Byzantines in later tellings. And it has some definite appeal. It is the preferred version of Venetian history for tour guides or history textbooks up until very recently. It is the classic example of the bootstraps narrative, which is where you start out from nothing, but you're scrappy and hungry, so obviously you will succeed against the odds. You know? There's a narrative logic to it. We love rooting for the underdog. Unfortunately, for our love of narratives, they are seductive and corrupting, and this one is no exception. This version of Venetian history has about as much historical proof and credence as George Washington as a child chopping down a cherry tree and saying, "Father, I cannot tell a lie, I did it." The actual founding and consolidation of Venice is a much uglier and more complicated affair. For one thing, the narrative I just told you was heavily pushed from the 12th century onwards by Venetian historians who wanted a noble, sympathetic backstory for their republic. Claiming that you're descended from the Romans gives you a whole lot of legitimacy. They also whitewashed away the foundational crimes of Venice, which we were about to get into. You see, the Venetians were more closely associated with the Carolingian Empire. If the Carolingians sound familiar, it's because you almost certainly know the most famous Carolingian of them all, Chuck the Great. They're a Central European or French empire, we could call them for lack of a better word, and they loved their conquering. And conquering in this day and age means taking land and taking people. Well, if you didn't choose to leave the people in peace, the best thing to do was to enslave them. But when people are products, you need somewhere to move them, and that's where Venice comes in, baby. Venice was in up to its elbow in the human slave trade. It was what made them wealthy. They exported slaves out through the Middle East and Mediterranean and grew very rich very quickly on this. They also maintained a tight bond with the empire that allowed it. That's their supplier. Venice is a middleman, and there's your happy customer who just bought a whole family to work to death. Like all empires, the Venetian Empire, but first the city-state, was built on the oppression and enslavement of other people. The Venetians just figured out how to get very wealthy very quickly off of this. And it's with this understanding that we have to proceed in any discussion of the early Venetian Republic. Empires cannot be virtuous.